Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines, and in this programme tonight we will be discussing the disgusting and immoral decision by the International Criminal Court to issue an international arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister for their conduct of Israel's war against the Islamist terrorist organisation Hamas in Gaza, and also for the immoral equivalence of calling for an arrest warrant of Israel's leaders together with three leaders of Hamas, thinking that Israel and Hamas are the same, when Israel is a democratic, free, independent state that abides by the rule of law, when Hamas is a genocidal terrorist organisation that controls a totalitarian regime in Gaza. And so therefore we shall be unmasking the evil agenda behind the International Criminal Court against Israel. Reagan, it's a pleasure to be recording another Behind Headlines with you. And when I saw this story last week, I really felt that we had to address it, because what we're seeing is these globalist institutions like the International Criminal Court coming against Israel for what is a just and defensive war against an Islamist organisation, Hamas, that committed the biggest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, and that was over 80 years ago in the Second World War.
Well, there truly is no moral equivalence between the free democratic nation state of Israel and the evil genocidal Islamist regime that is Hamas. In the actions of Israel since the 7th of October, when, I remind you, over 1,200 Israelis as well as some Nepalese, Thai and other individuals lost their lives. We've seen just response. We've seen an attempt to completely eradicate Hamas. That's been the goal, and to see the hostages returned. That's been Israel's right. That's across the world. There was recognition that Israel had the right to defend itself and defend its citizens. But Simon, this is just the latest in a long string of assaults on Israel and its freedom. And we should be reminded that it is Hamas's chartered constitutional endeavor and aim to completely destroy the nation of Israel and to eradicate Jews from the land. And Hamas to be included alongside Israel, and for Hamas leaders to be stood next to Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant in this ICC arrest warrant, desire for an arrest warrant, is just a complete nonsense.
Right, so on Monday, the 20th of May, the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan QC, of the International Criminal Court, actually issued this arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister and three Hamas leaders. So he's put out an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister as well, Yoav Gallant, and leaders of Hamas that include Yahya Sinwar, Mohammad Deif, and the Commander-in-Chief of the military wing of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. And also what he's doing, and this is what's so dangerous, I believe, Reagan, is putting this moral equivalency with Israel and with Hamas, when Hamas is a genocidal terrorist organisation that uses men and women as human shields. And let's also not forget that it was actually Hamas that started this war on October the 7th by carrying out the biggest massacre and crimes against humanity the Jewish people have seen since the Holocaust and the Nazis, and that was over 80 years ago. And so what their attack on Israel poses an existential threat to the Jewish state and Israel's very existence, whilst Hamas is wanting to destroy Israel as a nation state and to destroy the Jewish people all the way around the world. And it's this mixture of Islamism and Nazism that is the ideology of Hamas, that is the Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, what makes the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan QC, actually think there is a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel, when Israel is a democratic, independent state and it has democratic institutions together with the Supreme Court. The rule of law is in place in Israel, when we see in Gaza is nothing but a totalitarian regime that controls its people through fear and intimidation and violence.
I find it very curious, and part of me wonders if Karim Khan might be under significant amount of pressure. Maybe he would have found himself under immense criticism from various connections he has personally, were he to leave Netanyahu and others out, because there truly is no moral equivalence, even in how the arrest warrant request is put. If you look at what the emphasis is in relation to Hamas, indisputable crimes against humanity, including murder of civilians, deliberate target of civilians. These are not individuals caught in military crossfire. These are people who have been raped in their houses, who have been murdered in their houses of all ages. You have a number under the age of 10. There was at least 14 children killed between newborn and age of 10 on the 7th of October. And then others, of course, following that. But then you also have those as old as in their 80s who were abducted, in some cases Holocaust survivors also abducted and or murdered. And so this was a big part of this widespread systemic attack against the civilian population of Israel by Hamas and other armed groups that Khan speaks of in the arrest warrant for them. But then on the flip side, he calls for Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu to also face these arrest warrants. And the allegations include using starvation as a weapon of war, willfully causing great suffering, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, and other inhumane acts on Palestinian territory. And yet there's no real breakdown of what those other inhumane acts are. You can't just say, oh, and other inhumane acts, without, please spell them out. Please talk about the deliberate targeting en masse and enforced by leadership of rape on and sexual violence on Palestinian women. Please tell me, is that there? They just mention other inhumane acts. In relation to starvation as a weapon of war, it's totally bizarre, because you've had an increase in aid that's been going through all crossing points in the border of Gaza. Prices continued to soar as Hamas held back much of that aid. Gaza has thriving markets still. It's not like there's been a complete lack of food. It's continued to have open markets, and there's been produce, but the prices have gone very, very high in some parts. Since Israel began its Rafah offensive, the prices have completely dropped, because now aid coming through the Rafah crossing is under the oversight and control of the IDF, not Hamas terrorists. When Hamas terrorists have been involved, the prices have gone up because aid has not been going to where it's needed, and there's been an accompanying inflation, essentially, in relation to food prices. But now it's completely dropped by almost 300%. So this whole idea of using starvation as a weapon, it's easily discredited.
Yeah, which makes it sound very, very troubling. So the actual case that's made against Israel to bring arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister are not legally solid foundations or based upon facts at all. Now, it is very troubling also for the Israeli Prime Minister or the Defence Minister if they actually go and visit one of the countries that has signed up to the Statute of Rome, like Germany, for example, or even our own Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was saying that Labour could possibly arrest the Israeli Prime Minister if he ever visited London, if they were to win the next election. So what we're really seeing here, for example, is the use of law and the weaponization of war as another weapon against Israel. So we know that Israel is fighting an existential war against Hamas in Gaza through the Israeli Defense Force. We know that Israel faces a diplomatic war in the United Nations. We also see that Israel's facing a media war, this battle for truth. And also we see that Israel's fighting a war against the BDS, the boycott, divestments and sanctions, and on social media. And now this new front has opened up, this legal war that is designed to erode Israel's moral standing in the world, but also to make Israel a pariah state, and using South Africa, white supremacist South Africa, as an example to destroy Israel through the international community. So we see that there are political agendas at play with the International Criminal Court, particularly with the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, who is very much pushing this agenda against Israel, which is ungodly, it's immoral, and frankly, it's quite evil. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report from last week that talks about how the International Criminal Court is wanting to seek to pursue arrest warrants on the Israeli Prime Minister and Israel's Minister of Defence.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the decision a moral outrage of historic proportions that would cast an everlasting mark of shame on the international court.
Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage.
Netanyahu's response came after the ICC's chief prosecutor said Monday he's seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as 3 Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, for war crimes and crimes against humanity in connection with the current war. Israel's Knesset also swiftly opposed the ICC's action. Despite their political differences, a huge majority, 106 out of 120 Knesset members, signed a statement condemning the ICC's accusations. The statement says, in part, the scandalous comparison by the Hague prosecutor between Israel's leaders and the heads of terror organizations is an unerasable historic crime and a clear expression of anti-Semitism. Israeli President Isaac Herzog said the decision only emboldens terrorists around the world.
We will not forget who started this war, who raped, butchered, burned, brutalized, and kidnapped innocent civilians and families. We will not forget our hostages, whose safe return should be the main concern of the international community.
President Biden also opposed the allegations against Israel.
Let me be clear. We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide.
Internationally, France and Belgium backed the ICC's move for arrest warrants, but Italy called it unacceptable and absurd. Netanyahu said the charges against him were meant to take away Israel's right to self-defense, but he made it clear it would not stop the war against Hamas.
Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice. What a disgrace.
And while the ICC is accusing Israeli leaders of war crimes, the IDF says it has evacuated about 950,000 civilians in just 2 weeks from Rafah. Around 300,000 to 400,000 civilians remain, mostly in the coastal area. The speedy evacuation took place despite U.S. predictions that it would take about 4 months and high death tolls to get civilians out of the area. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thank you to our good friends at CBN for their efficiency and helpful reporting. Now, this announcement comes from the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, who is interestingly attached to the Ahmadiyya Islamic sect. And so you have to look at this through the lens also of some ideological influences as well. But he, in addition to the arrest warrants for Hamas leaders, as we've said, has applied for these warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. This is from The Spectator. On Hamas, he emphasized, we said, those particular crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, taking hostages, rape, and other sexual violence committed as part of widespread and systemic attack against the civilian population of Israel by Hamas and other armed groups. The chief prosecutor didn't include alleged crimes perpetrated by Hamas against Palestinian civilians, which have been very long-standing, goes back really to, well, it goes back before then, but you can see even the execution of its opposing political element of Fatah in Gaza back when Hamas seized control. Allegations that the terror organization continues to use civilians as human shields and has confiscated food and other humanitarian supplies meant for civilians in Gaza, or their very well documented and verifiable use of civilian buildings, such as hospitals and schools, for warfare. That also, Simon, is a legitimate war crime.
Absolutely, and according to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Gallant, the Minister of Defence, the ICC's allegations include using starvation as a weapon of war, willfully causing great suffering. Goes on to say as well, intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population and other inhumane acts on Palestinian territory. It says the announcement has been met with a furious backlash in Israel. Israeli politicians across the political spectrum have criticized Khan for lumping together the Islamist terrorists with their long record of crimes against humanity alongside the elected representatives of the region's only liberal democracy who are fighting a battle of self-defense. So again, I can see why there's absolute uproar in Israel regarding the International Criminal Court's decisions to issue an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister, because effectively this is fighting against Israel but using the arena of international law and the Court of International Law to bring condemnation against Israel, to erode Israel's moral standing. And if the Prime Minister then were to fly to Germany, could potentially be arrested, because Germany has signed up to the Statute of Rome, which is the founding treaty of the International Criminal Court. And considering that the International Criminal Court was set up in the aftermath of the Balkans War in the mid-90s in order to deal with crimes against humanity and genocide, the fact that Karim Khan actually believes that Israel is the one that's committing genocide in Gaza, deliberately targeting civilians in Gaza, goes against evidence. And we're talking about Israel's producing own evidence of going out their way to ensure that civilians are protected, in which is an incredibly dense population in the Gaza Strip, that Israel's having to fight not only against the Hamas terrorists and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, they're also looking for the hostages and are also wanting to destroy the thousands of miles of terror tunnels that are in Gaza. So it's like you have the civilians living above land, and then below the land in Gaza, you have where the terrorists hide out, where they are keeping the hostages and everything else. So it's incredibly complex military operation that Israel is pursuing. And yet the International Criminal Court want to tie Israel's hands and actually then prevent Israel from defending herself and erode the ability of the IDF to destroy Hamas. Which is absolutely abhorrent, considering that it's there to look into real genocides. And if it wants to look into a genocide, let's have a look at the genocide committed by recently in Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia, with the Azerbaijan's attack on Armenia. We can also look at October the 7th and say what happened then was a genocide committed by Hamas, and the Hamas leaders need to face war crimes and crimes against humanity. But again, let's put the innocent party, let's put the only democratic nation in the dock with a prime minister who's been compared to that of Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, who is literally has from everything I've read about him from an early age, committed so many murders in order to get to the top of this terrorist organization, and to actually share the same moral equivalency as Hamas and Israel. I'm not surprised the Israelis are angry. I'm angry. And this is a disgusting waste of the court's time. And clearly there are pressures and there is an agenda with the International Criminal Court.
Well, you mentioned earlier that the Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy had supported the ICC's calls. This goes completely against the UK's official stance and the government's stance, the current Conservative government's stance, which has condemned the ICC's ruling as unacceptable and out of order. And many other allies of Israel as well have done the same. Fierce criticism across the world. There's the recognition that Khan's decision is not supported by the UK government. We need to be very clear on that. It would be, according to David Lammy, supported by the government if we had a Labour government. So that's something to bear in mind in this election season. It added that the ICC has no jurisdiction in this case. And this is reassuring as well, because this is a lot of bluster. It has a lot of impact in one way on spreading misinformation and shaping and molding various individuals' opinions. But thankfully, the UK has recognized the ICC has no jurisdiction in this, as Israel itself is not a state party to the Rome Statute, the treaty on which this is based. The UK also has pointed out that Palestine is not recognized as a state. Khan has referred to it in his statement as the State of Palestine, but there is no such State of Palestine. The Czech Prime Minister, Peter Fiala, has called the move against Netanyahu and Gallant completely unacceptable. And as this has been mulling about for some time, there's been many Republican U.S. senators as well who've issued a warning to the ICC prior to the pursuit of this warrant that there would be repercussions if the court issued arrest warrants against Israeli officials. The senators warned that acting against Israel would undermine the nation's ability to act in self-defense against an organization seeking to destroy it by violent means and whose actions started the war. You mentioned a minute ago Yahya Sinwar, and just a reminder of the moral equivalence here. We have Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, who are doing their utmost to uphold the constitutional framework of Israeli society, which forbids racism, which incorporates people, whether Jews, Arabs, or Christians, into its society freely. Each are represented in the Knesset. There are Arab groups in the Knesset. There are Jewish, both secular and religious, and there's even a Christian member of the Knesset. So you have this freedom of speech and this freedom of religion that is upheld as a core bastion of Israeli free society. Let's consider what happens in Yahya Sinwar's world, shall we? So 2 years after Hamas was founded in 1987, he set up the group's internal security organization, the Al-Majd, at age of 25. He became infamous for punishing those accused of so-called morality offenses, and people were hunted down and killed if they were suspected of collaborating with Israel. He was responsible for numerous brutal killings of people suspected of cooperation with Israel, some of them with his own hands, and he was proud of that, talking about it to me and others, according to one individual speaking to the BBC, Ehud Yari, a fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So he's known by those near and dear to him as a murderer, a violent man who himself has a history of planning in 1988 the abduction and killing of 2 Israeli soldiers. He's been arrested, he's been imprisoned on multiple occasions, including convicted by Israel for the murder of 12 Palestinians. Okay, so this isn't about Palestine. This isn't about a free Palestine at all. This is about their own evil Islamist ideology being propagated and promoted. He has a history of it. Even a group like the BBC, not renowned for its honesty in relation to Hamas, not renowned for its pro-Israel status, has to report honestly that this man is a moral monster. And there's no moral equivalence between Yahya Sinwar and Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant.
And of course, also this is very much designed, I think, to play into the hands of Hamas as well, because, you know, this puts more pressure on the IDF, also puts huge amounts of pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, saying that if they need to go to have urgent talks with a European country or another country that's signed up to the Statute of Rome, then they could be arrested. And it just makes them think in the back of their minds, if we carry out this action against Hamas, what is the consequence of this? And of course, then what it is designed to do is really to stop Israel from destroying Hamas in Rafah and essentially letting Hamas off the hook for what happened on October the 7th. And again, we're seeing that these globalist institutions, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the International Criminal Court, is being manipulated and used for kind of evil and vile purposes in order to attack and erode Israel's moral standing in the world, which is dangerous. Now, according to an excellent article here produced by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, under the title this is one, it's called the Deflating the Threat Posed by the International Criminal Court. They say that experience has shown the International Criminal Court in its efforts to appease the Palestinians and vilify Israel has been willing to disregard facts and law and even make decisions lacking any jurisdiction. They say the prosecutor and the court have been willing to adopt factual and legal positions devoid of any basis and recognizing a state that does not exist, inventing its geographical territory and its explicit contradiction of multiple legal binding documents. So we see the evidence presented against Israel, and particularly to issue an arrest warrant on Israel is not even based on any facts, doesn't have any kind of solid kind of legal foundation that would be destroyed in court. So clearly we're seeing that the International Criminal Court has an ideological agenda against Israel, which is designed to support Hamas in its war against Israel.
This is an interesting feature of this, and it does make me wonder if some of this is just politics and trying to keep people on side by some within the ICC who have Islamist connections, because the crimes that are specified in relation to Hamas are very specific, and they're catalogued, they're verifiable, they're evident, they're easy to access. They were broadcast by Hamas across its social media channels on the day of October the 7th, and they've taken great pride in them since. Whereas the allegations against Israel are incredibly vague, non-specific, and unsubstantiated. Starvation of civilians is a method of warfare that can easily be ruled out, as we already have done. Willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment. Okay, define what this is. Some people have objected to Hamas terrorists being stripped down to their underwear, prior to their arrest. And I've even seen people say, oh, this is humiliating and a war crime. Well, actually, this is common procedure across the world when obtaining violent prisoners, even if you're incarcerating individuals in a gang sort of situation, the general procedure is to strip down to the underwear, to search, to hand over all weapons.
Well, the other reason they're doing that as well is because Israel, back in the second Intifada, had to deal with suicide bombings.
Exactly.
So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that some of the Hamas prisoners that have been caught could have a bomb strapped to their chest.
Yes.
And therefore blow up Israeli soldiers or anyone else being arrested. So, and also any hidden weapons that are kind of hidden away as well. Because
it's not unduly cruel.
We know, for example, that Hamas do not operate according to the Geneva Convention on warfare.
Right.
The fact is that they use women and children as human shields and deliberately want to put women and children in harm's way in order to maximize their propaganda campaign against Israel, to erode Israel's moral standing in the world through false and inaccurate media reporting that puts pressure on governments, in turn then puts pressure on Israel. And of course, we now see that the International Criminal Court is going out of their way, essentially, to help Hamas. Now, what this article goes on to say is that while the ICC is essentially a super national judicial forum, experience has shown that in its efforts to appease the Palestinians and vilify Israel, the court has been willing to disregard facts and law and even make decisions lacking any jurisdiction. So it said in the case of the ICC, Israel's fight is more political than it is legal, and according to measures that Israel must take to deflate the threat posed by the ICC are political, identifying and adopting the right move could entirely remove and negate the current threat and all future threats. So, but also thinking within these kind of big new globalist organizations as well, is that they are based upon this false model and this false mindset that we can live in a world with peace. All nations that have conflict with each other, all they have to do is negotiate and we can end this settlement. When what happened on October the 7th was the biggest massacre and the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history. And for Israel's deterrent capabilities and our future survival as a modern, independent, democratic Jewish state, Israel had no other options but to send in ground forces into Gaza to destroy Hamas after what happened. I mean, what other nation wouldn't defend themselves? And the real danger with this proceedings against Israel by the International Criminal Court is that what's to stop them going after British troops after carrying out wars in Afghanistan or Iraq, and also erode the West's ability to deal with Islamists, states that sponsor international terrorism, that pose a direct threat to not only the security of the Middle East, but also the free world, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that if we then went to war against Islamist regimes, we could then find our own defense minister, our own generals, our own soldiers in the dock for alleged war crimes when there are no war crimes actually exist. So it's not only Israel that's going to be in the dock, but it's the Americans and British soldiers and military personnel who could also find themselves in the dock if the West doesn't stand up to the International Criminal Court.
I mean, it's important to understand some of the background. Israel was involved in setting up the ICC and campaigning for it to be set up, but then this was hijacked and politicized. It singled out Israel specifically, and so Israel did not join the court. So the question has to be asked, if Israel is not a party to the court, how's the court considering wielding jurisdiction? Regarding the United Nations, the Israeli statesman Abba Eban famously quipped, if Algeria introduced a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 abstentions, which shows the perception as to what Israel is up against in this situation. In 2012, the Palestinian leadership, the PLO and the PA, petitioned the United Nations to recognize the state of Palestine. While no such state actually exists, the UN General Assembly decided to grant Palestine the status of a non-member observer state. So to some degree, you could say semi-legitimizing the existence of such a state, while also recognizing such a state doesn't truly exist in any meaningful way. After being accepted to the court, the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas established this committee that included members of Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other internationally designated terror organizations to engage the court. And so it closely operated, this terror committee, closely cooperating with the ICC prosecutor, submitting hundreds, if not thousands, of complaints and reports. At one stage, the PLO and PA boasting that the terror committee had met on more than 80 occasions with the office of the prosecutor. Who is the prosecutor? Karim Khan.
Which is incredibly disturbing. The fact that terrorists belonging to the Palestinian Authority, including the PLO and also Hamas, to actually meet with representatives of the office of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is shameful, knowing that these are terrorist organizations, but also then a big question about the evidence that they are giving to the International Criminal Court also should be questioned and examined for its truthful content, because we know that there is a definite agenda here to put Israel in the dock and never actually put the Palestinian Authority together with Hamas in the dock for the ones that have been committing war crimes. But leaving this aside, let's just add another equation to this one. Look at the way that the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas actually treat their own civilians. Let's look about anyone who dare call out the corruption of Mahmoud Abbas, say on social media. They'll be arrested, never seen again. And so therefore there isn't that democracy, there isn't that freedom within the Palestinian Authority to even speak out against the corruption by the PA. And if you did speak out against Hamas in Gaza, well, you're going to be tortured and your life is going to end in the most horrific manner. And yet the International Criminal Court seems to give legitimacy to international global Islamist terrorist organizations like Hamas and actually sit and meet their representatives, which is disgusting. And of course, this goes a long way into where we are today and the International Criminal Court deciding to issue an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister. So let's have a look at this news report that's over a month old by our friends at CBN, entitled "The ICC Threatens to Charge Israel with War Crimes as it battles Hamas in Gaza." And this gives us a little bit of context of why the ICC has decided to issue an international arrest warrant for the Prime Minister and Israel's Defence Minister.
The International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has warned that he's considering war crimes charges over Israel's conduct of the war and its blockade of supplies into Gaza.
I have to say that Israel has clear obligations in relation to its war with Hamas. Not just moral obligations, but legal obligations to comply with the laws of armed conflict.
The United Nations is also collecting evidence, saying Israel may be committing the crime of collective punishment with its siege.
We want the International Criminal Court to hold Netanyahu accountable for the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that Israel is committing.
First of all, nations are not charged with war crimes, individuals are. And those charges don't come after weeks, but in most cases after many years of investigation. The International Criminal Court would also have to prove Israeli officials willfully tried to kill civilians or cause suffering. Jeffrey Korn, former U.S. Army senior advisor on law of war issues, currently leads the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. He says war crimes are not committed simply because civilians die, but how and why they die.
We don't define a war crime in an attack by what occurs. We define a war crime in an attack by the decision to launch the attack. So it's a conduct-based equation, not a result-based equation. And so when we look at the images of destruction and civilian suffering in war, and we jump to the conclusion that that must be a war crime, that's like saying 1 + I don't know equals war crime.
The Israeli Defense Forces Code of Ethics sets a very high bar, stating, "Every human being is of value, regardless of his or her origin, religion, nationality, gender, status, or position." The IDF servicemen and women will act in a judicious and safe manner in all they do, out of recognition of the supreme value of human life. Andrew Tucker is an expert in international law in The Hague, Netherlands.
That doesn't mean Israel doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't mean Israel doesn't do wrong things. It simply means that in terms of process, in terms of decision making, it's, I think, indisputable that Israel holds itself to the highest moral and legal standards.
Some of those who want Israelis charged for war crimes are very upset with Karim Khan for not having already issued arrest warrants, with the anti-Israel BDS movement branding Khan a genocide enabler. But some believe it's all but assured Israelis will be charged, with so many international agencies, including the United Nations, aligned against Israel.
Most Israeli military leaders know that no matter how hard they try to actually and comply with the law and do their best to deal with this difficult situation, they're going to be condemned.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Very grateful, as always, to our friends at CBN, and in particular, good to see our friend who's often appeared on the program, Andrew Tucker of the Think Initiative in The Hague, who's arguing the following, that in their view, a decision to issue warrants against Israeli leaders at this time would be highly problematic for various reasons. They outline those reasons as it's immoral and contrary to the principles of international justice to equate Israeli and Hamas leaders. What we've been saying throughout this program, Simon, that Israel is fighting a multi-front war, defending itself against an existential threat of violence directed against its citizens, fueled and sponsored by powerful states such as Iran. Qatar as well is involved. You know, Qatar is acting like this neutral party trying to peacemake and make deals and stuff, but Qatar is complicit in this on multiple levels, not the least of which is bankrolling so much of these terror initiatives.
And also, really, providing a safe haven for Hamas leaders.
They're there at the Four Seasons.
That are multi-billionaires living in Doha, under the safety and the protection of the Qatari government, which is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, so therefore supports Hamas in its genocidal terrorist war against Israel.
The charter of Hamas clearly states its fundamental existence and endeavor is going to remain until it exterminates Jews from the land. That's what it says in the very first page of its charter. It's consistently attacked Israel and threatened to repeat October the 7th, not least of which has been just in the past few days a recurrence for the first time in 4 months of missile attacks on Tel Aviv and Herzliya and the surrounding regions, forcing so many to seek refuge in bomb shelters. Israel is fully entitled, and its allies have recognized this, to address and remove the threat facing its citizens. This threat that has continued for years, that has, Simon, been given time after time after time, again, chance after chance. Opportunity to reform itself, opportunity to work towards peace, opportunity to somehow, in one way, inexplicably, coexist alongside the free democratic nation state of Israel. A few years ago, we saw thousands of rockets fired upon Israel. In 2021, massive attack. There was minimal response from Israel at that time, even though it had every right to go in and conduct the operations it's conducting now. After a similar volley of rockets on October the 7th that gave distraction, essentially enabling a massive ground offensive that was successful in its massacre of 1,200, not to mention hostages taken as well, we see that Israel has acted. They've acted rightly. They've acted in a precise way. They've acted with forbearance to some degree. They've been very cautious, especially in going into Rafah. They, despite Blinken and Biden's protestations and claim that it was impossible to provide safe zones for civilians, they shouldn't go into Rafah. Almost 1 million civilians have been safely evacuated into humanitarian zones within Gaza. where there has been tragedy. That tragedy has been caused not directly by Israel, but by essentially the harboring of Hamas and their vehicles and munitions being affected by shrapnel and whatnot from air assaults on Rafah. So you see there's been no deliberate attempt to target civilians by the IDF. Where they've gone into hospitals, they've evacuated the hospitals. The fact that we're even having to talk about the IDF going into hospitals is only there because Hamas sets up shop and
headquarters, yeah, exactly,
in hospitals,
exactly. But it's also interesting how the Institute Think is actually then saying how the ICC's decision to issue an arrest warrant against the Israeli Prime Minister is illegal. They talk about the request is a further demonstration of how the court is being instrumentalized and politicized by UN member states hostile to Israel, because the International Criminal Court is an agency of the UN, and hostile member states of the UN are using UN institutions as a means of declaring war against Israel. It also goes on to say that Israel has a robust legal system and diligently investigates any alleged crimes or violations of law. Cases concerning alleged violations of humanitarian law in Gaza are already under investigation by Israel's judicial authorities. In these circumstances, the ICC should be recording to Article 17, verse 1. The statute declares such cases. And also saying that by issuing arrest warrants conflicts with the principles of complementarity, thereby the court should only intervene if the state is concerned or willing or able to intervene, is the cornerstone of the ICC's justice system. I mean, firstly, the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over Israel because Israel hasn't signed up to the Rome Statute, which is the founding treaty of the ICC, and therefore Israel is not in its jurisdiction. And yet the International Criminal Court believes it is. So it goes on to say this one, that the court lacks jurisdiction to prosecute Israeli leaders. Palestine is not a state and Israel is not party to the Rome Statute. The ICC pre-trial chamber decision in 2021 that the court has jurisdiction undermines the basic principles underlying the court, namely that it only has the powers that the sovereign state confers on it. Palestine is definitely not yet a sovereign state, and Israel is not party to the Rome Statute, so neither can be conferred any powers to the court. So we see really that the ICC is actually in breach of its own guidelines and its own power, and is clearly driven by a political, ideological agenda to attack Israel.
Well, and this is seen all the more when we actually analyze some of the specifics that the prosecutor brings forward, saying that the siege of Gaza, as he calls it, also includes cutting off cross-border water pipelines from Israel to Gaza, Gazans' principal source of clean water, for a prolonged period beginning on the 9th of October of 2023. The entirety of this statement is completely untrue. Prior to Hamas's devastating attack on the 7th of October 2023, Israel supplied less than 10% of the clean water used in the Gaza Strip. So there would be ready access to clean water. Not that Israel is under any obligation to provide anything to an enemy state. This is the only situation I'm aware of in the world where it's anticipated that a state that is at war with another is supposed to supply all that's needed for life.
I say if this was going back to 80 years ago to the Second World War, there's no way that the Allied forces would be conducting such a war against Germany or Imperial Japan. And also the fact is that effectively any kind of government that's experienced the horrors of October the 7th and with their hostages would then demand the release of hostages in return for humanitarian aid. But because of the international pressure that's placed upon Israel and because of Israel's incredible humanity, the nation of Israel has had to supply aid, has had to go in there and supply water, because effectively Hamas is using these as kind of weapons and mobilizing the people of Gaza and using them as human shields against Israel.
Well, in the course of the attacks on the 7th of October, 2 of the 3 pipelines bringing water into Gaza from Israel were damaged, but Israel says that these were repaired, and within a very short matter of 6 days, that the supply was restored. And so this completely does away with this idea, this fabrication essentially of the prosecution that they were keeping clean water from Gaza. 10%, and that which was lacking restored within only a few days. Khan also accused Israel of cutting off and hindering electricity supplies from at least 8th of October until today. 9 out of the 10 power lines from Israel to Gaza were damaged on the 7th of October. Electricity used by Hamas to light and ventilate its terror tunnels and to launch its rockets aimed at Israeli civilians. Much of the electricity in Gaza is produced by individual generators, and Israel has allowed in enough fuel to generate electricity for essential services, despite the risk that this fuel is taken by Hamas. Indeed, we've heard a lot less of that in our foreign media and press, but there was outcry over the lack of fuel, and we had the goalposts moved time and time again. It was always, we're running out of fuel. There'll be no fuel in Gaza within a few days.
And what does Hamas do with that fuel? They use that fuel and energy and the electricity to fire their rockets and missiles. We come down to the end of the program, and Jonathan Tobin, the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, writes an extremely interesting article under headline, "Don't Downplay the Impact of the ICC's Indictment Against Israel." And what he's saying is that after this indictment to arrest the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister of Israel, the next stage then is to attack Israel like apartheid South Africa was attacked, so that Israel will be a pariah state, that Israel will face international isolation, even facing economic sanctions, including kind of international boycotts against Israel. So this is the next stage of the plan. So he's saying essentially in his article that the Americans don't care about the International Criminal Court, because thankfully Biden has come out and condemned the International Criminal Court. Also, the Israelis are not interested in the criminal court, but it's different when it comes to Europeans and the rest of the world, who value the International Criminal Court as a globalist organization that seeks to bring justice against genocide and war crimes. But instead, we know that Israel is being manipulated. Israel is being attacked through the International Criminal Court in order to erode Israel's moral standing in the world. And the next thing we're going to hear, that Israel is essentially an apartheid state, that Israel is a racist state, so therefore the state of Israel has to be destroyed. And those that hate Israel will try to destroy Israel like they destroyed the apartheid regime in South Africa. The only difference is Israel is not a racist state, it's not an apartheid state, and this is effectively against the only democratic nation in the Middle East, which is the nation of Israel.
October the 7th continues to serve as a reminder that hatred for Israel isn't about its actions so much as its existence. The movement to boycott Israel with BDS measures hasn't done much damage to the economy up to this point, but the shocking support for Hamas and condemnations of Jerusalem's efforts to eradicate a movement dedicated to Jewish genocide demonstrates just how much the impact the efforts of the boycotters have had on opinions around the world, with very few not upholding the UN, the Human Rights Council, and the ICC as the agenda-driven groups that they actually are.
Let's see now a statement made by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for his arrest.
The outrageous decision by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the International Court. Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage. Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace. The prosecutor's absurd charges against me and Israel's defense minister are merely an attempt to deny Israel the basic right of self-defense. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail. 80 years ago, the Jewish people were totally defenseless against our enemies. Those days are over. Now the Jewish people have a state, and we have an army to defend our state. Notwithstanding the blood libels Mr. Khan has leveled, Israel will continue to wage this war in full compliance with international law. We will continue to take unprecedented measures to get innocent civilians out of harm's way and to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need in Gaza. Mr. Khan also sets a dangerous precedent that undermines every democracy's right to defend itself against terror organizations and aggressors. The ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and Mr. Khan's actions will not stop us from waging our just war against Hamas. But Mr. Khan's abuse of this authority will turn the ICC into nothing more than a farce. He's doing something else. He is callously pouring gasoline on the fires of anti-Semitism that are raging across the world. Through this incendiary decision, Mr. Khan takes his place among the great anti-Semites in modern times. He now stands alongside those infamous German judges who donned their robes and upheld laws that denied the Jewish people their most basic rights and enabled the Nazis to perpetrate the worst crime in history. 2 weeks ago, on Holocaust Memorial Day, I pledged this: no amount of pressure and no decision in any international forum will prevent Israel from defending itself against those who seek our destruction. To all the enemies of Israel, including their collaborators in The Hague, I renew that pledge today. Israel will wage our war against Hamas until that war is won, because never again is now.
That video was courtesy of the Israeli Prime Minister's office, so thank you for that. And also, Reagan, great to be doing a programme on such an important topic.
Likewise, yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I pray that it's of help and enlightenment to our viewers.
Amen. I want to thank you for watching this programme today. We have to call out the International Criminal Court in The Hague because it's evil and it's immoral to have a moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, and it just shows you that the International Criminal Court has lost its moral clarity, and what it's doing against Israel is fundamentally wrong and threatens not Israel's democracy but also our democracy and freedom as well. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.